But there's a sacred function of humor, and that's really where things get really interesting.
I want to introduce to you Erik Davis, who is our speaker at this session. He is an author and award-winning journalist and scholar based in San Francisco. His wide-ranging work focuses on the intersection of alternative religion, media, psychedelics, and popular imagination. And he is the author of a very interesting book called High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experiences in the 70s. And several other books, all worthwhile, such as The Visionary State, A Journey through California's spiritual landscape, and also the sort of cult classic Technosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, which actually yesterday inspired an entire panel. But I'll stop speaking, and here's Erik Davis.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you. Good to see you. So I come here today, I'm putting on the hat of a long-time participant, observer, and historian in the counterculture, or the underground, as I'll call it. So I first dropped acid as a young teen in Southern California in 1980. And a few years later, I'm dancing with the Grateful Dead, and I'm reading Carlos Castaneda, and absorbing the sort of residue of the counterculture, which was a little bit older than me. And subsequently, I went on to study alternative religion. I got a PhD in religion. And meanwhile, for the last 25 years, or 25 years ago, I started to participate in the kind of equivalent of ICPR back in the day, which were these more underground but still intellectual university style, if non-university sponsored, psychedelic gatherings, which were quite interesting. So I've been part of this field for a very long time. But because of my orientation, I'm not particularly invested in the medicalization, the mainstreaming, the questions of therapy and ethical formulations and venture capital. I'm observing all that, but it's not really where I'm coming from in this talk. In other words, I don't really have a pony in this race. What I do have, though, is a new book. And that's my little cue there for Blotter, The Untold Story of an Acid Medium. And this was a wonderful opportunity to go into and work with a fellow named Mark McLeod, who in the early 1980s started to collect LSD blotter art. And he subsequently showed it as an art form in the late 80s, and then he subsequently began making it for the underground. So the book is partly about his story, but it's also really a history, a kind of media studies of the medium, and it also becomes kind of a social history as we look at the icons and the images. And so it was a wonderful opportunity, but it also gave me some ways into what I'm concerned about today. I'm not going to talk about the book too much. I'll weave it in, and in fact, instead of the usual PowerPoint, I hope you don't mind, a friend of mine, Yoshu Jones, who's part of the Psychedelic Sangha crew in New York City, whipped together a video. And so we're just going to ride with the video, and hopefully it's fun. But what I'm concerned about today, and what I want to focus on, is what we could call the ancestral legacy of the counterculture. I think there's a lot of reasons to be listening to indigenous voices right now, and one of the things we feel is an understanding of the respect for tradition and the value of what has come before. But for those of us who are not indigenous, who are in Western weird societies, in some ways, in many ways, I would say that drug-taking bohemia and subsequently the counterculture or the underground is sort of our ancestors. But of course, it raises a number of questions. It's in a way difficult. How do we access this knowledge? Because in a lot of ways, it's as fragmented and pluralistic as the West. And there are a number of problems. One is that we all have kind of, particularly with the counterculture, or the acid underground, which I'll be mostly talking about, we already have kind of ideas in our head. We have like the 60s, and we have images, and Kent State, and Tim Leary, and we have this kind of very overdetermined, but also very narrow in some ways, story that's kind of difficult to get beneath, and there's all the problems of nostalgia. You know, so that's one. Another one is that a lot of the interesting stuff is hidden. It's hidden because it was illegal, it's hidden because it's informal and small level, it's hidden because it's done by people who aren't interested in publicity or who don't write books. There's not a lot of great books that come directly out of the counterculture, though there's some interesting writings. So it becomes a little challenging of like, how do we connect with this stuff? And the third problem, which is really relevant today, is that the counterculture often functions as a foil to contemporary psychedelic science and psychedelic discourse. It's sort of the bad cousin, or it's the case of what we don't want to happen. It becomes a sort of cautionary tale. And indeed, there's many reasons to emphasize the negative functions of uncontrolled situations, too large doses, people who aren't prepared, the messiness, the informality, the rise of gurus. That's all there. I'm not denying any of that stuff. But I'm more interested in trying to pluck out positive stories. And it's not just to honor our ancestors, which I think is actually a legitimate ethical call to really pay attention to the folks who are doing this in our societies that came before us. But it's also because we're facing this problem of what Thomas Metzinger called enculturation. How do we enculture people in ways that allow them to access and deal with the difficulties of these substances? And I don't believe that we can do that without plugging into some of these wisdom traditions. That to try to make it all new and make it all bright and shiny for our moment today misses the opportunities, misses the resonances, and misses the histories. So what do we do? How do we connect these things? Well, it's the humanities and history. It's understanding and being interested in these tales and uncovering points of reference or individuals and characters and scenes that are valuable. And it's also in bringing a humanistic sense to the cultural artifacts, the stories, the music, the art, the theater that come out of these traditions that are part of the transmissions themselves. So I mean humanities less in the critical sense that humanities often mean today. There's plenty to critique in this tradition, absolutely. But I'm talking more about a fine-tuning of our ability to tune into these objects and art and stories. So as I said, I'm particularly interested in, and we'll talk now just about the acid underground, just to talk about LSD, partly because of Blotter. And as many of the images you're seeing, like this one, are from the book and from Mark's collection. You know, so acid is very interesting, particularly when we think about the power of plant medicine and the indigenous traditions connected with it, because it doesn't have any indigenous tradition connected with it. Or if it does, it's our indigenous tradition, or mine, I should say, because some people here are indigenous. And so it is, you know, fundamentally of modernity. It doesn't have a pre-modern reference. And if it does have a pre-modern reference, if they really were mixing up some mystical LSD, it was probably at the Eleusinian mystery, so it's already part of the Western story. And that gives it an interesting character. For one, there's no problem of appropriation, but more interestingly than that, it's a constant mirror of our own condition as moderns. There's no way out of the trap. It's bound up from its beginning with psychiatry, with mind control, with intelligence agencies, with celebrity, with bohemia. And that is, in my sense, a value because it gives us an opportunity to rethink and reframe the world that we're actually in. Yeah, yesterday in his presentation, Taita Juan Batista was talking about, he's a Yahe guy, and he was talking about, I've tried all the medicines, and he was talking about going around and trying all the different kinds of plant medicines, including psilocybin, which isn't local to South America, and he was, had some comments about it, and I was really hoping he would say, yeah, and I went even more north and tried this LSD to kind of get a sense of what that medicine would have been like. It reminded me that Claudio Naranjo, who is a transpersonal thinker, really interesting fellow, went down to study ayahuasca in the 1960s, and he brought some LSD with him, and apparently the Kofan tribe that he was dealing with quite liked the medicine. So it's an interesting kind of conjunction there. So The way I see it is that there's kind of an elephant in the room in the whole field of psychedelic science. And the elephant is, I'll call it, you can call it by many names, the sacred. In fact, it's better maybe not to think of it as an elephant, but as Dan Kyman remarked when I brought up this idea the other day, it's the Ganesha in the room, right? What do we do with the sacred? It's a problem. Here's some problems. So the Johns Hopkins study, Roland Griffiths, was motivated on some level by spiritual investments. And that had produced a lot of really great work. It kind of got the field going. But at this point in the game, it's created a problem where it sort of can be attacked from two sides. From the scientific side, you can say, what is all the spiritual stuff doing here? It's getting in the way. We got to get rid of it and get more down to brass tacks. On the other side, it gets critiques from people like Joe Welker, who see it from a religious perspective as a kind of bastardization of spirituality and a very problematic one. This ties into the so-called mysticism wars. What is mystical experience? How do we talk about it? Is it even a real thing? Can we assess it with social science interviews? Does it exist? The idea of mysticism that motivates the mystical experience questionnaire and other sort of mystical registers is itself rooted in a particular history with a perennialist backdrop that from other religious perspectives, including indigenous ones, doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's a problem. Another problem is the great absurdity in the United States that the DEA, the most corrupt and arguably least sophisticated of the federal agencies, is in charge of authenticating new psychedelic religions. You know, that's an absurdity that points to this problem. What do we do? There's other problems. There's the problem of delusion and of conspirituality, the sort of meshing of spiritual worldviews and conspiracy, and this problem of what do we do when this stuff just gets completely widespread and with the media. That's a huge problem. And behind it all, though, is in a way the kind of larger problem, which is what do we do with the religious experiences themselves? So I wanted to suggest that the counterculture has some interesting responses to this. And the one that I want to talk about here is humor, of all things. One of the things you'll notice with a lot of the blotters is they're kind of funny, they're kind of silly. Well, what's that about? Well, it actually opens up a whole history of kind of sacred humor inside the psychedelic world. You have the merry pranksters with their goofiness. You have Art Kleps's Neo-American Church, which was created at Millbrook in the 1960s, the place that Timothy Leary ran. And they were like a satirical religion. They worshipped a three-eyed toad. They called for the annihilation and destruction of Saturn. And they called themselves boohoos. And so there's this kind of silliness going on. There's also the Discordians, the Church of the Subgenius. I talk about these things in High Weirdness. And there's this kind of humorous, satirical goofiness in relationship to the sacred that's a very key element of acid consciousness. So what's going on here? What's this humor about? Well, it serves a number of functions. My colleague Christian Greer points to the sort of social bonding factor, that people can use humor as a way to connect, right? It's a way to sort of define an in-group against an out-group. It's also as good a way of forming community as sacred experiences. You can blend, you can come together with a laugh. There's also a kind of skepticism involved in it, that a lot of people who are interested in acid, while interested in sacred experiences, were not interested in dogma. In fact, Art Kleps, who is the Neo-American Church guy, he has this great line that I want to read, where he talks about he was noticing the rise of Asian gurus and the programming they offered to people, and he was resistant to it. And he said, "I'm more interested in a more honorable, if less popular, Western history of visionary and mystical experience, coupled with the vigorous advocacy of human liberty and political radicalism of every kind." So here you can think of someone more like William Blake, who was, of course, very important to Allen Ginsberg and other people in the counterculture, as an example of this a kind of mode that, again, embraces spiritual experience, sacred experience, but also has a lot of room for cognitive liberty, and therefore a certain kind of criticality in relationship to dogma and belief and the kind of delusions that can happen to people. In this way, humor is a way to undercut those tendencies. So that's a very important factor as well. But there's a sacred function of humor, and that's really where things get really interesting. We can think of, for example, the kind of the cosmic giggle, the sense that in the confrontation with the full weirdness of cosmic reality, that a laugh is as appropriate a response as any. That Shiva's dance is a laughing dance, or the Zen slapstick that inspired so many of these people. But even more than that, there's an even subtler function of humor from a sacred perspective. And this is very true for the merry pranksters, which is that humor, mockery, and satire are a way to clear out the inevitable human tendency to create dogmas, to create overdetermined stories, to create fixed ideas in this nebulous space of sacred experience, to clear it out and get back to a more fresh, novel, and immediate sense of the sacred. And this really motivates one of my favorite lines from Ken Kesey, who was, of course, the non-navigator behind the Merry Pranksters, which is that while he himself was interested in Christianity, connected to Unitarian Universalism, one of the acid tests took place at a Unitarian church, he had a great line, which is, "It's sometimes worse to take it as a sacrament." So think about that. Think about what he's trying to do there with this kind of blend of the sacred and the profane. One way of thinking about the sacred and profane, I think, is really good, comes out of the religious historian Mircea Eliade. And in one sense, Eliade was an essentialist. He said the sacred exists in all societies. And the sacred, to be the sacred, is always in relationship to the profane. So there's always a tension between the sacred and profane. But in other ways, he was a more modern kind of constructionist in that he said, but the sacred can be anywhere, and different societies will locate it in different places. So really what's essential is this kind of pivot between the sacred and the profane. And if you look at psychedelic humor, if you look at this tradition that I'm talking about, a lot of it has to do with this sort of turning of the sacred into the profane and the profane into the sacred. I mean, one of the things that I like to say is that there very much is a kind of sacred consciousness within acid culture, but it's really more about the relationship between the sacred and profane, that twist, that unexpected slide between registers as part of the message and part of the experience. So one of the things that I really liked about Blotter, I mean, there's a lot of really cool things about it as a way to study, to look at acid consciousness, because it's made by anonymous people. It's not signed. The images are drawn from everything. And it functions in a really interesting way because these are, of course, material objects. It's a reminder that drugs, even though we talk about them in terms of experiences, we might talk about them in terms of almost invisible molecules, and in the case of LSD, like really almost invisible, almost homeopathic doses of this material will affect these extraordinary changes in consciousness and experience. But they still need a material vehicle. They still, in fact, with acid, you have to put it on something. It's very, very difficult to take LSD directly. I mean, some people have. You have the pure crystal. It can get you high, but it's impossible to control the dosage. So it needs a material medium, a drug delivery device, in order to be part of a market, to be distributed. And so one of the interesting things about Blotter is that it's completely sufficient from the perspective of a drug delivery device to have a blank piece of paper. In fact, a lot of people prefer blank Blotter. When I was a teen, most of the Blotter that I ate was blank. So the images that are on it are completely unnecessary for as an item of profit or an item of drug delivery device. In a way, it's a kind of pure excess. It's a kind of extra semiotics. It's a way of sort of adding something to the experience or wrapping up the gift that you're receiving in a funny package or a beautiful package. And indeed, some of the blotters were really elaborately presented. Some sheets came wrapped in origami or in beautiful boxes with wrappings, all this kind of an unnecessary packaging that pointed to the awareness that this mystical substance, this potentially sacred material, was also something that got traded. And indeed, some of the blotter images would play with the kind of consumerism that this involves. So you have ones that would use logos like McDonald's arches or the Prudential Insurance Company. One of my favorite of these is a bunch of sheets that featured the genie character called Mr. Clean that was part of Procter & Gamble's detergent projects. It was a beautiful, witty image because it's a genie. It has this kind of magical quality, but it's also a character in the consumer landscape, and his name is Mr. Clean, i.e. clean LSD. And so that kind of humor is very much about acknowledging the way that for whatever other meanings that it has, acid also has a concrete, profane dimension that has to be acknowledged and affirmed inside of the work. One of my favorite figures, and I think you've seen him jump across the stage already, is the figure Mr. Natural, who is a cartoon character from the notorious Hate Street artist R. Crumb. And Mr. Natural is kind of a groovy mystic. He's bald head, big white beard, robes, cruises along like the kind of characters that you'd see in the Hate or in Burning Man today. And on the one hand, he symbolizes the kind of mystical potential, the possibility that acid can kind of free you and plug you into a natural way of being, a kind of organic mysticism. But in the comics, Mr. Natural is also kind of a rogue and a rake, not someone you would necessarily trust with your ontology. And so, again, by including Mr. Natural, it's this way of gesturing towards this problem of the sacred, that the sacred is never clean and pure and perfect inside of these contexts, but must be treated, again, humorously or with a degree of satire involved. And what this kind of points to, again, is that there is this sacred dimension to the actual LSD trade. So here's where the rubber hits the road, because yeah, there's this wonderful sacred substance, people have remarkable experiences, but in order to get it to them, you kind of have to be a criminal. And so crime enters into this weird sacred connection. So how do we deal with that? How do you deal with the conjunction of God and crime? And one of the interesting things about the acid trade in particular is that the makers and distributors of LSD very rarely had much connection with other drug networks. This was true then, and it is true today. Even today, most of the LSD is manufactured by some well-established families. Some of them go back decades. And they maintain a kind of hermetic, esoteric kind of control over the substance. Very few of these families have been busted over the years, for example. And I found a remarkable DEA manual from the 1990s that said it really clearly. It said, you have to understand, you agents out there going to bust these people, that they're motivated not just by profit. There is what they call ideological or crusading aspect to the trade, or in a way, a kind of investment in the transformative sacred potential of these molecules, and yet they're still very clearly criminals. Another example of this kind of sacred dimension to the manufacture and distribution of the drug was the belief by many acid chemists that at the moment of synthesis, when you're finally going to, the crystal is finally going to emerge from these various processes that you've gone through, that it's really a good idea to be pure of heart, to offer prayers, to have beautiful music. And many of the acid manufacturers, Owsley, Nick Sand, and others, talk about this need to be well aligned in order for the crystal to be as pure and remarkable as possible. So this gives us kind of a kind of outlaw spirituality. And in religious terms, you can compare it to a really important feature of Tantra, right? And I don't mean like cheesy sex tantra, I mean the classic stuff. And inside Vajrayana and other tantric traditions, there are materials that are effectively illegal or inappropriate or taboo in a society, and those products like meat or sex with people that you're not married to have a certain power precisely because they are antinomian, they are against the law. So there's a kind of extra tantric charge to these materials that I think, at least in the case of acid, is very much part of the culture. So while I'm not saying that criminality is a good thing, obviously it's a terrible thing for people to go to jail for these things. And in the case of acid, they went to jail for a very long time for reasons that I won't get into. So it was a very dangerous trade. And yet it was one in which that criminality produces a certain kind of value set. And some features of that value set aren't negative. That's the thing. It's worth paying attention to some of the positive features of them in the sense of the way that they build a kind of camaraderie, they build a kind of, they force a kind of esotericism and a kind of purity to the motivations that people bring to the trade. And then it's important to honor that and to recognize it. One video that I really highly recommend people go check out along these lines is with an acid dealer on a YouTube channel called Soft White Underbelly that looks at sort of marginal communities, homeless people, drug addicts, and they're just interviews with them. And this guy named Joel Blazer tells his story. He who ends up being a convict in a supermax prison, really, really tough prison experience. And he starts out in the 1980s as an LSD dealer going to the Grateful Dead. And of course, in a way, the Grateful Dead is what I haven't been talking about as I've been talking about the whole time, because there you have the situation where, in Blazer's terms, he goes, look, it's like a church. LSD for us is a sacrament. It provides spiritual experiences. I knew that what I was doing was a good thing, and yet you're doing it in this context where it's highly illegal. And, you know, just to say a little bit more about the Dead as a great example of this, precisely this tension of the sacred and profane, you can even hear it in the music. They would follow an epic space jam where you go through all of the cosmos and these beautiful, strange musical evocations of alternate dimensions, and then the next tune will be like an R&B number or a cowboy song, this kind of tension between the sacred and the profane, even in the music, and certainly in the dancing. And the dance is another whole part of the countercultural underground tradition that we pay far too little attention to when we're thinking about appropriate ways to move through the difficulties of psychedelics. Dancing is a remarkable method, one of my absolute favorites. So here's this great line from Blazer, who met through his trade, met some chemists, became kind of higher up in the trade, and he has this great line: I had this incredible fear of going to prison. There was this juxtaposition between what I believed in and what I'm willing to risk my freedom for. Deep down, I knew LSD was not bad. It was something I loved to do, but the penalties for it was unbelievable. And then he was busted. And when you're busted, you have a choice to make. And the choice is that everything that the DEA can do, or the federal government, or the cops that are on you, is to rat on the people above you. Right? And it's a huge deal. He's sitting there, he's a young man, he's looking at 40 years in prison, and he has this choice to make. Do I rat on the good people who have been providing the sacrament to me? And he chooses not to. Now let's think for a moment about what that means. Like the moral force of that activity. It's a profound and really powerful thing to consider, and it has a lot to do with the value set that we're talking about. So he goes to prison. He has a terrible experience, and let me see how my time is. Yeah, I can still do this. The one line that I want to pull out of what I just read is his mention of risk. And risk, I think, is another one of these elephants in the room. We just heard, if you were in here, Jules Evans, provided a really wonderful and thorough explanation of the risks involved in taking psychedelics. And of course, Most of the people here are invested in healing. They're invested in regulatory mechanisms, in questions of how do we train therapists, how do we train people who are engaging with people. It's all about minimizing risk. And I'm all for minimizing risk. And indeed, within the counterculture, there are a lot of mechanisms for minimizing risk. There's discussions of sitters or trip advisors or people who are helping them that go all the way back. And of course, you know, the therapy itself emerges from these needs from within the underground. But it's really important to say that we haven't really wrestled with the positive existential feature of risk, that risk is part of the picture. These drugs are dangerous. Taking them with a therapist is dangerous. Taking them in a psychedelic church is dangerous. There's danger in the picture, and that danger, I believe, we're not really recognizing. We're not really wrestling with the positive function of risk. I mean, it's a complicated topic, and I'm not saying, oh yeah, make things riskier, it's better for everybody, by any means, but there's still a positive function there. And one way of thinking about that is to just think about extreme sports. Like there were, I think last week, there were two a skier, mountain climber folks who died in the Alps. And when you read the sort of accounts in the newspaper, oh, they were, you know, it was a terrible tragedy and they took this risk, but, you know, we admire the extreme athlete. But we don't have the same kind of admiration for the extreme psychonaut, even though in some ways the extreme psychonaut is rolling the dice. And there's a danger there, and there's a positive feature of the danger. There's something that comes out of confronting actual and existential and ontological risk and coming up yourself or with your community and with help from others in a way to kind of navigate that risk. There's one line, and that risk isn't just physical or psychological, but even spiritual. There's a quote from a Grateful Dead song that I'll just quote. It's part of the Terrapin Station suite. And there's a fire, and this sort of djinn, this beautiful woman djinn, comes out of the fire, and there's these two characters who are sitting there. And she says, which of you to win me tell will risk uncertain pains of hell? If you will not, I would not forgive you if you will not take a chance. And there is something like that chance, that risk that goes on within psychedelics that we have to honor and acknowledge in a way that we tend to not do with our concerns, fully justifiable, for modulating risk. So I want to end with just the end of Joel Blazer's story. So he's in a supermax prison. It's super nasty. He's just gotten the shit kicked out of him by the guards. He's sitting there in the hole, in isolation, and the guards come in and they're taunting him. They're talking about having sex with their wives, and they're trying to get their goat. And he has this moment where he realizes he's probably going to get out pretty soon, and he goes and he gets this moment where he has total empathy and sympathy for these guards. And he says, look, I'm not religious. I wasn't in AA. It must have been the acid that gave me this perception, where he says, I'm part of the whole. I want to be part of the whole. And I realize that if I hold on to resentment against these prison guards, I'm going to be in prison for the rest of my life. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let it go. I'm going to embrace the totality and not stay in a mental prison. And then at the very end of the interview, he says, and I'm really glad that I didn't tell. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erik. Very inspiring. And we have 5 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please come up to one of the mics. I see already people coming up. So yes.
Okay. Thanks, Erik. That was really interesting. So I have a comment and a question. So on this role of humor or the function of humor, another thing is that a laugh to a joke is involuntary. It's an involuntary response, okay?
Beautiful.
So Aleister Crowley used humor and jokes to communicate magical secrets. So in other words, when you get the joke, you laugh, and that's how you know you've got it. The famous example is the Book of Lies, chapter 69. And the title is The Way to Succeed and the Way to Suck Eggs. Yeah. And so there's a joke there, and if you get it, you know what that chapter's about. And it's that involuntary response that confirms, aha, my understanding aligns with the intention of the author. So, and I think Wilson picked up on this as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, and my question is, for example, when Wilson wrote Illuminatus trilogy, and Wilson is writing about conspiracy theory, he's explicitly doing it to encourage people to be more skeptical of authority, more skeptical of their paranoid thoughts, recognize their own bullshitting of themselves, and to have a sense of humor about it. And in some sense, it seems like almost the opposite has happened in many areas.
Oh, yeah.
And could you maybe talk about this and the absence of humor sometimes in the psychedelic community, and also the absence of skepticism with regard to authority?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'm totally with you. I think that there is an absence of humor in the situation that's part of the problem. But it also has to do with what's different between the 1970s and today in terms of social media, the infectiousness of conspiracy theory, et cetera. When High Weirdness came out, I thought I would spend most of the time talking about Philip K. Dick and maybe Terence McKenna, but I ended up on all these podcasts talking about Wilson and talking about conspiracy theory because it was during QAnon and all this stuff was happening, and I was saying, look, this is why this was actually happening, but in many ways it's like his joke worked, or his prank worked, but the pranked is us, and we didn't get it. And so, you can make an argument, and many people do, even like Wilson fans who say, yeah, those approaches no longer work for the situation we're in. And I think it's true in some ways that that it's a very narrow path to be able to maintain that degree of skepticism in the midst of the kinds of experiences and the kind of reinforcing narratives that surround us. So it doesn't necessarily scale very well, and I recognize that problem, and that in some ways we're in a different world. Nonetheless, it still stays with me that we can do a lot more to keep that humor and to keep the recognition that skepticism is not just a way of like tamping down this rich phenomenology, but actually a way of clearing the board so that we can be more open to the transformation and the ongoing dance of the experience. So more jokes. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one more question, and that will be also the last question. So.
Dance, yeah. Erik, thank you. Great work. Love it. I'll try to loosely tie things together with my question. I think maybe today the game is to make psychedelic therapies a reality. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned respecting, learning from, honoring our ancestors, which in the Western cultures are to some degree the counterculture, and whatever we could learn culturally, philosophically. Perhaps one of the examples, and if you could expand on that or others, was dance.
Mm. Yes, thank you very much for doing that. It was one part I didn't make room for it. But as somebody who has danced probably primarily through my experiences more than anything else that I've done, one of the things I was flashing on it. Well, there's two modes that I think are important. We talk about dance, but the other one is walking. A lot of my experiences have been cruising around. Going through adventures. Burning Man, of course, is a great place to manifest this, but so can be a suburban area or a forest or wherever. And the walk is amazing because anything that comes up, you can engage and move through. You're literally moving through a journey of the spaces. So even if very difficult situations come up, rather than just sitting there and kind of holding in it and you can just sort of work around it. And so there's so much working out that happens in the movement of the body. And in a way, a dance is just a richly articulated walk or run through the spaces of possibility. And on top of that, it's a beautiful way of being with others without speech, without any kind of shared sort of symbolic connection. You can be just participating with the energies of people around you. So there's a collective dimension to the dance that, of course, anybody who's done this kind of thing knows very, very well. And it's done without authority. It's done without dogma, without a church form. And so what looks like hedonism in some ways, to my mind, is actually a very rich, embodied, and celebratory way, and also sometimes a frightening way or a difficult way to move through these experiences. I mean, I think I'll end with just a memory, which is that the first Dead show I went to, they had the sound tower in the middle of the floor, and with, you know, the stage on one end, and I was just cruising around. I was walking through, seeing what was happening, and I came and I walked behind the sound stage. So the only people who were behind the sound stage didn't care about looking at the band. They couldn't see the stage. So what were they doing? They were dancing, but they were really dancing. They were remarkable dancers, and I still remember them. I still remember the way the eyes would move, because you're not looking at the stage, you're looking at fellow dancers. There was a kind of passage of movements, of gestures, of experiences that I received. And I feel transformed by that, and I feel like I received a kind of initiation into a sacred hedonistic dance that motivated me for the rest of my life and that I can still fondly remember. So thanks so much for your question. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Erik.